So just to reiterate, why do we need to perform this out of order execution of loads or reordering of loads? Because we want them to execute as early as possible so that any future dependent instructions can start soon. Now, how do we perform this out of order execution? We follow a method called load bypassing, which means basically if there is a load, store, and a load, we allow this load to bypass this store and execute ahead of it. And only if it does not alias with a previous store. So this reordering of load or bypassing of this load is allowed only if it does not alias with this store, which means that the memory addresses that it points to is not the same as the memory address pointed by the store. So we make sure that it does not alias with the previous store. And if that is the case, you can go ahead and perform this out of order execution. Now, how do you check if it is aliasing or not aliasing? It can be done by comparing the addresses in the store buffer. So if you look at the hardware here, we have the store unit and the load unit, and we have these buffers here. So in addition to just writing the data here, the store will also have to write the address and save the address here. And the load will have to do a match. It can either match parts of the address or it can match the complete address. And if there is no match, it can go ahead and execute out of order. But if there is a match, it cannot go ahead and execute out of order. So this is called as load bypassing. It can also be done with the help of a load store queue, an LSQ. So this is basically a single queue in which you maintain all the load stores and their addresses along with their values. This is another model or another way in which you can perform this comparison. So we make an entry for every load and store in the load store queue. We calculate the effective address and put them in order. And for every load that comes in, we're going to check if there was any previous store which has the same address. So if no, so for example, if this was 300, we let this load go ahead and execute. So that is called load bypassing. You execute the load ahead of the previous stores. You can perform memory access. But of course, it has to follow the ROB and it has to commit in order, but it can still go ahead and execute out of order. But if this load had an address which is same as any previous recent store, then this load cannot go ahead and execute out of order. It has to be done in order. But there is another method which we can employ here. So as we saw previously, if there is a store and a load in sequence and they're accessing the same memory location, so essentially what we are doing is we are reading this R2 into this R4. So that is what it is doing. We are storing R2 into a location and reading from it. So what we can also do is instead of the load going to the memory and reading the value, we can directly forward this data from R2 to R4. So although you are not letting the load go ahead and execute out of order, we can follow this method which is called load forwarding. So basically here we follow the same steps. We put all the load stores in this load store queue. We check if there is any load which has matched with a previous store's address. So for all incoming loads, you're going to check or match this address with the previous store's address. And if it matches, we will not go ahead and execute the load out of order, which means you're not going to go ahead and do memory access. But what we can do is as soon as this data for the store is available, that is this R2 is available, this can be forwarded directly to R4. So of course, this has to follow the in order commit and all that, but there is no need for the load to go and do the memory access step. So basically this is called as load forwarding, and it significantly improves the performance of the load because we are just forwarding the data and we're not really doing a memory access. So the hardware for that, there needs to be slightly additional hardware. First of all, the complete address of the location has to be saved in this store buffer to do the match. The load anyway has the complete address, so it will have to do a complete address match. And it could also be possible that there are multiple stores before this load. So for example, if you have multiple addresses and you have a load coming in, you'll have to check with all previous stores in order to check if there was a match. And if, for example, this was also 100, and you'll have to also make sure that you read from the latest store and not from a previous store. So you'll have to have some kind of a priority encoding here done to make sure that you compare this load with the latest store which has the same address, and you forward from the latest store. So all of this extra hardware will have to be added, and obviously the store buffer will need an additional read port to forward the data to the register. So all of this extra hardware will need to get added. Okay, so let us now consider another scenario here, wherein so far we have been assuming that from the reservation station you are dispatching or issuing the load stores in order to the load store execution unit. So let us assume that we are allowed to perform the effective address calculation out of order. Okay, so which means that we performed the effective address calculation of this load, whereas a previous store does not yet have this effective address available. Now, when can this scenario occur? So, for example, you have the store who is dependent on a previous multiply to complete, which is taking a lot of cycles, let's say not 100 cycles, maybe 10 cycles to complete. So which means that the effective address of this store is not yet available, whereas the load has already completed its effective address calculation. So in this case, we do not have a way of comparing this load to this previous store. So now what if this was 400? So we still do not know, and therefore we cannot perform the comparison. So what are the available options with us in such a scenario? So maybe at this point you can pause and think what could be the different possibilities for us to go ahead from here. Now, one of the options is, and which is usually followed, is do the effective address calculation always in order. So the effective address calculation here is always performed in order, which means that you still do not perform this calculation till this store has completed its effective address calculation. So this is a very neat way and usually followed in most speculative processes. But the disadvantage with this is that you're unnecessarily holding up this load. And the other disadvantage is that if there is a cache miss with any of these, then you are also unnecessarily holding up the future instructions. So this is a good method, easy method, but then it is not going to yield a very good performance. So the other method is to issue load stores from the reservation station to the load store units in an out of order fashion. You allow the effective address calculation to be done out of order, but the load will have to wait till all previous store addresses are known, because that is the only way in which you can figure out if there has been an aliasing. And if the store address arrives and you figure out that there is an address match, then you can perform load forwarding. And if you figure out that there was no match, you can allow it to go ahead and execute. But again, this is unnecessarily going to delay the load, because you've calculated the effective address, but you're still waiting for the store to complete. Therefore, another method which is used is called speculative load execution. This is an aggressive approach and used in most modern processes. So what we do is, if the store address is not yet available and the load has already calculated its effective address, then we are going to compare this load's address with all previous known store addresses. So this store address is available, so you're going to compare it with it. If it is not a match, then we're going to assume that this pending store is also probably not dependent. Okay, so basically we're going to go ahead and proceed with the load, that is loading the data from the memory, assuming that there is no dependence on a previous store. So we're going to do what is called a speculative load execution. Speculation means you're kind of predicting it. You're predicting or you're assuming that this load does not depend on a previous, or it does not alias with a previous store, and you're going to go ahead and execute. Now, once you execute the load, which means you're going to load the content from the memory, and let's say at some point the store address becomes available. So once the store address is calculated, this store should check with any of the future loads if there was any dependent address, which means the store, once it completes its effective address calculation, will have to check with all the trailing loads to see if there was any load which was aliasing with it. So when this comparison happens, and if the two addresses were different, then the load is fine. If it has already loaded the data from the memory, it's still fine. But if it results that, if the result is such that the address is the same, then we will have to undo this load, or we'll have to invalidate this load, because this load is referencing to the same location and it was not correct for it to go ahead and execute in an out of order fashion. So this is like prediction. So you predict, assume that it was different and go ahead and execute, and later you find out that they were same, so you're going to flush this load and then restart this load. Another method is also very similar to speculation, which is predict. So instead of simply assuming that this is not dependent on the previous load, on the previous store, what you can also do is you can keep track of a lot of previous stores. If there were previous stores, you can keep track of a lot of them, and you can predict based on that whether this load is likely to be aliased with any previous store. So this is again a prediction. This is also kind of a training the sequence of load stores and predicting, and how effectively can you predict, how efficiently can you predict this dependence well. So that is a different topic on memory dependence predictors. Now, what is the hardware required for speculative load execution? So first of all, to reiterate the steps, we proceed with loading the data from memory. So in fact, first of all, to begin with, we do issue the load stores from the reservation station in an out of order fashion. Secondly, we calculate the effective address in an out of order fashion. And we also send the address to the memory and fetch the data from memory in an out of order fashion, assuming no dependence. But we should also make sure that the load is not allowed to commit the results to the register until it makes sure that it did not alias with the previous store. So this is very important. So although you load the data from the memory, you have to still wait to make sure that no other previous store was aliased with this load. So effectively, you are waiting until this store has calculated the effective address. But the advantage in speculation is that you have already done the memory access. So you save a lot of time and improve a lot of performance here. And you also need to make sure, obviously, that you do not commit the results in an out of order fashion. So you have to first complete the store, commit the store, and then commit the load. So all of that has to be maintained with the help of a log, which is not shown here. So how are we going to make sure that the data loaded from the data cache is stored until you check this effective address? So basically, we're going to add what is called as a load buffer here. It's called a finished load buffer, which means that the data has been accessed from the data cache in an out of order fashion and stored here in this buffer. So it is going to wait in this buffer until a previous store has completed its address calculation and you've compared the address with the current load and you made sure that it is not aliased. So if there is aliasing, let's say after you figure out this address, you figure out that it is aliased, then what you should do is you should invalidate the load, flush this buffer, and reissue the load and restart this fetching from the memory. So this is how speculative load execution is done. So this is an example, a couple of examples we'll discuss before we complete this topic. So we have a series of load stores in a load store queue. It's called the LSQ. And this is the status of the memory. The memory address and values are shown here. We are also showing the ROB here. So this is a load or a store, the address, if there is a match, and what is the value. So now when we do a load, the data loaded from memory is written here. When we do a store, the data to be stored in the memory is written here. And whenever we get a load, what we do is compare it with the previous store. So if it matches here, then it means there is a match and you're going to do data forwarding. So this load is not going to go to the memory. If there was no match with this store, so okay, let us assume that we are currently in this particular load and we have this address 300. So we compare it with all previous stores. So this does not match, but then there is a match here. So we are going to forward the data that is 25 directly to this value here. So why does the memory contain the old values? Because we still have not committed the stores. So let us look at how do we do that. So when we assume that this is at the head of the ROB, this is the ROB shown here, the load is going to update the register. Then we have the store. So this store is now going to get committed to the register, to the memory. So which means that we're going to write 25 into location 300. So we've updated the memory content and removed that entry from the ROB and obviously also from the LSQ. And at a later point in time, if you have this store at the head of the ROB, you're now going to write 45 into memory location 100 and remove that content also from the ROB and from the LSQ. Now, at this point in time, let's say you have an exception, then what you do is you're going to flush the ROB and as usual, you're going to let all previous instructions complete. And it would have completed in the ROB here. And we also flush the ROB for all next instructions. We also flush the LSQ. And at this point in time, the memory state or the content of the memory is the most recent. And therefore, the exceptions can be handled well in this case. So this is the content I want to cover for memory dependencies. If people are interested in reading about memory dependence predictors, you could refer to these ones, and I'm not going to be covering this as part of the main content in this course.